Hello, everybody. Happy Thursday. Welcome to this week's live training. Hello to everybody in the Facebook group that's watching. Um, let's turn this off. Hello to everybody on Instagram that is watching. Thank you all for being here. Again, happy Thursday. I cannot believe it that August is almost over. That's crazy to me. Where did summer go? I'm not ready for fall. Slow your roll, fall. I want some more summertime, but here we are. It is almost September. I'm so happy to be here today talking about one of my most favorite topics to talk about, and it's documentation. I have so much to say about documentation. Now, don't get me wrong, I hate it. I don't like doing it, but I do love talking about it. I do love teaching students and new grads how to be badass documenters in the clinic. Okay, so today, that's what we're going to be doing. I'm going to be reviewing some of the basics of documentation, going over some tips on how to show skilled documentation while you're also being efficient with it. And then I'm also going to be sharing some keywords and phrases to avoid, some things to avoid when you are documenting, okay? So my goal here is to help you really just be more efficient with your documentation, be able to write notes that you know when they're audited, or if they are audited, you know that you're not going to get any denials, okay? I know documentation sucks. I 1000% agree with everybody, but we have to do it, right? It's how we get paid. It protects us if anything ever happens. Say, unfortunately, a patient or a family member wants to sue you 3 years later, you are protected if you've got good documentation. And it helps any clinician that is following behind your session. They know exactly what you did last session and how to move forward with that patient, okay? Anybody that is new here, I am Dr. Jody Miller. I'm a physical therapist and I'm a PT, a mentor to PT students, more specifically new grads and clinicians. I've worked in just about every setting that you can think of for PTs. I've done acute care, I've done oncology, I've done a lot of outpatient, I've done home health, I've done pediatrics, I've been a travel therapist. Most of my time has been in skilled nursing. I was a rehab director, and I've also done some adjunct teaching. But now I have my own cash-based practice here in Florida. And I am also the owner of Clinical Connections Mentoring, which is where you are right now. What I'd like you to do is, if you are watching live, please type live in the comments, whether you're watching on Instagram or you're watching in the Facebook group. Tell me where you're from. I want to know who I'm talking to. If you are watching the replay, same thing, just type replay and tell me where you are watching from. But I also want to know, if you don't mind, please drop in the comments, what stresses you out most about documentation? Or what is the greatest stressor for you when you think about documentation, okay? Kind of want to know who I'm talking to and how do you really feel about documentation, okay? So let's get started with a really quick review of the basics for anybody watching that is new to documentation, or maybe anybody that just kind of wants a refresher for documentation. We're going to start there. So I basically want to talk about just a SOAP note. It is the simplest form of documentation, right? But nowadays, everybody has their own EMR or their own EHR in every clinic, every facility, every hospital. Everybody's got a different one. Some create their own, some build their own. And then the fun part for you is that you get to learn a new system every time you go to a new clinic, okay? Not fun, right? It'd be nice if it was just one system, but it's not. So I always tell students, though, that if you can remember the basics of a SOAP note, then you are moving in the right direction, okay? Hi, Spry PT. Thanks for coming. So let's review the basics of SOAP notes. So S is for subjective. Literally anything the patient tells you, how they're feeling, where their pain is, where their problems started, what are they having trouble doing? Literally anything that the patient says to you during that session is going to go on the S for subjective, okay? O, objective, anything you do, test, measure, anything you do during that session, range of motion, MMT, gait assessment, balance testing, outcome measures, TheraX, manual therapy, gait training, transfer training, literally anything that you did while the patient was there with you is going to go in the objective part of documentation, okay? A is for assessment. Here is where you're going to tell the story. whether it's the story of what happened to the patient to bring them into you for an eval and what you found during that eval and what all of that means, or whether it's the story of how a treatment session went. How did the patient respond? Could they tolerate more of something? Did they need less of something that day? How were they doing overall? The assessment is the time for you to tell the big picture story of what happened, why that patient's there, what you're going to do for them, or what you did for them. Okay. And P, the last part, is the plan. So what is the plan moving forward for the rest of the plan of care for the next session? Okay. Basic, simple overview of what a SOAP note is. So all this format really helps to break things up. If you're using a SOAP format, it's really more important to focus on just getting the information into the document, right? Especially since most EMRs don't really follow that SOAP note format. The most important information that you need to have in the note is the skill that you provided and what exactly you did during that session with specifics. Those two things, you got to have the skill and then specifics of what you did, okay? The skill part can typically go into the objective section or the assessment section. I always say it doesn't matter where it goes as long as it's in the note, okay? Sometimes it does make more sense for it to go into the objective part where you're describing exactly what you did during the task. Sometimes it makes more sense to put it into the assessment portion where you're describing how you use skill to tell the story of that session or that eval, okay? So let's kind of break those two up. So in the objective section, you can include the skills that you provided during that specific intervention. So any verbal or tactile or visual cues that you gave. If you measured vitals during the task, did you facilitate movement patterns during transfers or gait, things like that, right? It's much easier to document the skilled services you provided in the objective section because you're writing exactly what you did to help that patient, right? But sometimes it makes sense to put the skill in the assessment, right? So here you can include the skill that to basically tell the story of what you did to help that patient during that session, right? Things like patient needed less verbal cues this session. The skill is the cue part, but you're putting it into the assessment. The patient's oxygen dropped to 90%, so the patient was instructed in deep breathing techniques, right? So that's the skill, but you've put it into the assessment. Patient showed less fatigue, so the reps were increased to 15 today, things like that. Those are the types of ways that you can show skill in the assessment portion of a note, okay? It is much harder to show skill in the assessment, but you're really more showing like medical necessity here, which is also important because this is how you're explaining how the patient responded, how they're progressing, and the need to continue with therapy, okay? Now let's keep talking about skill and how to document it efficiently, right? Remember, the skill is the most important part because this is what insurance companies are looking for. But this is also where clinicians tend to get kind of tripped up or where documentation tends to take a little bit longer. We know it's the hard part, right? We know that we provided skill, but the hard part is putting that onto paper, right? Okay, so when you're thinking of skill, I'm going to give you some words that you should use or that you can use to help show skill in your documentation. They're things like analyze, assess, direct, downgrade or upgrade, educate, modify, progress, teach, cued, assisted, facilitated, measured. Those things are showing that those are words that are showing that you actually did something. Okay. So when you're trying to show skill in your documentation, use these words and it shows that you actually did something during that session. Here are some examples of some unskilled words. So these ones you want to avoid, things like supervise. That just means you're just watching somebody do a task. You're not doing anything. If you're just supervising them, that's a word that explains that you didn't do anything. Okay. Observe, again, you're just watching, not doing anything. Monitor, again, just watching them, right? Maintain means you're not showing any progress. If you use that word maintain, you are no longer showing progress, and that's going to kick back for insurance companies, okay? Practice. In other words, try not to use practice when you're documenting because it's just saying that you're having someone practice something that's not skilled. Again, you're not doing anything. The patient's just practicing something. You're not doing anything, right? So those words they try to avoid using those words, right? They don't really show that you did anything for that patient, but things like cued, assisted, facilitated, taught, educated, those are showing that you were doing something during that session, okay? So one of the reasons that documentation can take so long is because we need to be specific and detailed when we're writing what we did. And this is, again, we all know it's getting harder. They're making it harder. They're asking us to write more, but it really is for two other reasons. One, we need to make sure that anyone that comes behind us, maybe it's a PTA or a CODA or a PRN therapist, they come behind us, they need to know where to pick up where we left off, right? And it also helps protect us in the future. Somebody sues you, you want to be able to remember exactly what you did and what happened. And clear documentation will help you do that. This has happened to me. I worked in a skilled nursing facility. The family was suing the facility. And for whatever reason, I actually had to meet with a lawyer. They pulled up my notes. It was from like 3 years prior. I had very little recollection of the actual patient, but they gave me my documentation. And they said, like, review your notes here and tell us, is this what happened? Can you add anything to it? And because I was so clear and specific in my documentation, I was able to remember everything. Okay. You don't want that to happen, but if it does, if your documentation is clear and includes enough information, it will help you remember years down the road. Okay. But detailed documentation does not have to be a paragraph. Okay. Let's go over an example of this. So here's an example of a statement. Okay. Patient ambulated 100 feet in the hospital hallway with a single point cane with min assist at the gait belt and the shoulder to maintain the patient's balance and to prevent loss of balance with minimal assist to advance the left lower extremity and to increase hip and knee flexion during swing phase 25% of the time and facilitation at the left pelvis during stance phase to increase stability as the patient advances the right lower extremity. Whoa, that's a lot, right? Now, it's very detailed, it's very specific, you can picture all of that, but that is a lot of writing. It's a lot of words, right? So let's see how we can shorten that and still say the same thing. Okay, here's how you can shorten it. Patient ambulated 100 feet with a single point cane with min assist for balance and to advance the left lower extremity during swing phase 25% of the time. But patient also given facilitation at the left pelvis for stability during stance phase. Still showed a lot of skill. You can still picture what's happening, but I did it much shorter, right? Still has everything that we need to replicate the situation. You saw all the words with skill, right? The amount of assistance that was provided, what it was provided for, how much of it, that's all skilled. And it's reproducible because we know how far they went. We know what assistive device was used, and we know what the therapist did and why. But it was much shorter than that first big paragraph, right? So you can still be specific and have skill and be able to picture, reproduce what was happening without having 1,000 words in a paragraph, okay? But let's go the other way, and this is where most therapists tend to go. Let's look at an example that doesn't have the skill or is not reproducible, okay? So sometimes in documentation, because of time, therapists want to be a little fast. They'll just write patient performed rows with a TheraBand for strengthening. This doesn't really say anything. I can't reproduce it. I don't know the specifics of that exercise, and there's certainly no skill here. Okay, so let's fix it. So patient performed standing bent arm rows at 90 degrees of abduction with a red TheraBand, 3 sets of 12 with verbal cues for scapular retraction to keep their shoulders down. Still see the difference? This one definitely shows skill because we have the cues that we had to give. It's reproducible. We know exactly what was done. You can actually picture the person doing this task, right? But it's also not a novel. It has the detail, it has the specifics, but it's not too wordy. It's not too wordy, and it definitely didn't take me very long to write that statement. Okay. Now, what I want to do is move in and talk about some common documentation problems and pitfalls that you really want to avoid. And these are some red flags that insurance companies really like to look for. They actually pay people just to look for these things. Okay. They are things that they look for so that they can quickly deny payment. Okay. So the first one is parrot documentation, which is just basically saying the same thing every visit. Most therapists I've seen it done, they're just copy and pasting the previous note into the next note. Nothing really changes from one session to another, right? I know there's plenty of people out there that do the copy and paste because of time. I get it. But this is a red flag. Okay. Don't copy and paste. You have to change something. If you're doing the same thing every session, you're not even showing progress for that patient. So it's going to get kicked back. It's going to get denied by insurance. Okay, the next thing is undefined abbreviation. So really just saying don't make up any abbreviations, only use approved abbreviations. This can be really tempting to make your own abbreviations to make your documentation quicker, but don't do it. Only use abbreviations that are approved. Okay, next one, lack of substance. Basically just all the last example that we just talked about. If there's nothing there, if it's just a statement of, patient did rows, that there's nothing there, there's no skill. Okay. And the last one is I want to talk about some specific phrases that you really want to avoid in your documentation. There are two phrases I'm going to talk about, and literally their auditors are taught to find them and deny payment. First one is patient tolerated treatment well. Who's used it? I did a lot at the beginning of my career. I no longer use it now. It's really, really common to see this phrase. You've probably seen it yourself, you've probably written it yourself, but it really says nothing about how the session went. Just leave it out. Don't put it in there. Okay, no need. You don't need it. Instead, write what actually happened, even if they did well. So instead of writing patient tolerated treatment well, you can write patient able to tolerate more reps today with fewer rest breaks. Oxygen stayed above 98%, right? That tells me a lot more, shows skill, right? And now I know that the person was measuring oxygen, but it also shows progress. Instead of just patient tolerated well, tell me like how well. This statement now says how well the patient tolerated it. Okay. The other one you really want to avoid, the other phrase is continue plan of care. Another really common phrase that therapists tend to put in the plan of care. But again, it does not give much guidance. If like say you're sick and a PRN therapist has to come in the next day, then they now have to go look into the plan of care. They have to look back at multiple visits at what was done. So instead of just continue plan of care, just write out specifically what you want to do the next session. Things like increase upper extremity exercises to 15 reps, increase gait distance to 500 feet, trial the wide-based quad cane for transfers, add standing exercises. It doesn't have to be too super specific, but just give some direction on what you want to do that next session. One, in case you forget. Two, if somebody else comes behind you. Okay. So to review, you need to include skill documentation in your notes, right? It's easier done in the objective portion, but you can also show the skill and medical necessity in the assessment portion of a note. Try to avoid words like observe, practice, and supervise, because these words don't show that you did anything skilled. Be specific when you're writing about what you did, but also be brief. Okay. But don't be too brief that it's not clear what you did as the therapist, right? Don't be too brief that you don't include the skill. And try to avoid the use of, or actually don't use the words tolerated treatment well or continue plan of care. Okay. I hope that these tips and tricks were helpful for you. If you are a student new to documentation, please make these documentation your habits now. If you've been documenting for a while, maybe been a clinician for quite a few years, I know it's hard, but please try to make these some of your new habits. Like I said at the beginning, helping clinicians with documentation is one of my most favorite things to do. I've helped clinicians build their own documentation templates. I've helped clinicians or businesses build entire documentation programs. I've done documentation audits, and I've helped work through other ways of being more efficient with documentation, right? This is just one of the areas that I guide new grads and even seasoned clinicians to improve or become more efficient with in my complete clinician mentoring program. It is much easier to talk through documentation when we have specific examples, and it definitely gets easier with practice and more repetition. But the steps that I gave you today, kind of the tips and the tricks that I gave you today, is a really good place to start if you feel like documentation is hard for you. If you feel that being efficient with your documentation is a real struggle for you, please reach out. Send me a DM, send me a message, comment, complete below in the comments, and I'll reach out to you. We can figure out what we can do to help you make it more efficient, make it better, make it skilled, so that you're not getting a lot of insurance denials or kickbacks. Okay. I'd love to help you figure out how to make this easier so that you can continue to enjoy this career. I don't want the worsening requirements or needs of documentation to start to frustrate and burn everybody out that they want to leave, right? Let me help you make it easier so you can stay in this awesome career. Okay. I hope you learned something new today. Please go ahead and drop in the comments your aha moment or something that really stood out for you or something new that you learned about documentation and how to be efficient with it. I want to thank you for coming and watching, whether you're on Instagram or whether you are in the Facebook group. If you have any questions about what I talked about today, please feel free to message me or leave your questions in the comments and I will definitely come back and answer. And I will see you next time. Have a good Thursday.